Welcome. Once again, this is Mr. Thomas, and I am on episode 5 from chapter 8, and we're talking about changing playback speed. Previously, we talked about changing the speed of clip plays in the timeline by using a 4-point edit. Now we're going to talk about changing the playback speed of a clip in a different way. Now, slow motion or fast motion are two examples of retimed footage. Slow motion means that it plays slower than real life, real time. Fast time or fast forward means that it plays, of course. Fast motion means it plays faster than real time. And I'm sure you can think of many examples of these different playback speeds, these different retime clips that you've seen in sports, slow motion replay, for example, or fast forward. Like I know there was an old show called Benny Hill that always had a comedy sequence where the policeman was chasing the robber and it was in fast motion and it looked real funny. Um, but the changing playback speed section of the chapter starts off by explaining what, here it is, by explaining what playback speed really is and how it's executed. And the first thing it tells you is the main thing you want to know is the best way to have retime effects take place in your project is to shoot it fast forward or fast motion or shoot it slow motion. It explains that in the text. They say that's the highest quality footage you're going to get, because if you shoot it like um, say your project is at 30 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and you shoot it at 30 frames per second, and then you try to speed it up or slow it down in post, you're actually either adding or taking away frames in the computer from footage you shot. And it's always going to look a little bit artificial when you do that. It's not going to look as smooth as when you shoot it slow motion or fast motion in the first place. Okay. The disadvantage is once you shoot it slow motion or fast motion, if you decide that you don't want it like that, sure, you can speed up slow motion footage in the computer or slow down fast motion footage in the computer. But once again, it's not going to look as natural and as fluid as if you would have shot it the standard frame rate in the first place. Okay. And shooting fast motion and slow motion has to do with everything has to do with the frame rate, because you have a frame rate that you shot the footage at and the frame rate at which you play it back in your timeline. So say if you have a camera and you're shooting all your footage at 30 frames per second, and if you shot 2 seconds of footage at 30 frames per second and you play back that same 2 seconds of footage in your timeline at 30 frames per second, so you haven't done any retiming effects, what's going to happen is that it'll take, if it's a 2-second clip, that's 30 frames per second, 60 frames total. It'll take you 2 seconds to watch that clip in regular time in the timeline, all 60 frames at 2 seconds. That's with no retiming effects. However, let's say you shot your footage at 30 frames per second, okay? But let's crank it up a bit. Let's say you shot your footage at 60 frames per second, okay? And your timeline, your sequence is set up to show you footage at a 30 frame per second frame rate, okay? So if you shot it at 60 frames per second, let's say you have 2 seconds. 60 times 2 is 120. You have 120 frames altogether that you shot on set. You're bringing it into a timeline that is going to play back footage at 30 frames per second. A really easy way to determine exactly how long it's going to take you to look at this footage is to say, okay, I got 120 frames in my timeline and my sequence is set up to show me 30 frames per second. What times 30 is 120? 30 times 4 is 120. Okay, so it would take you 4 full seconds to watch the footage that you shot 60 frames per second. Okay, over 2 seconds. It took you 2 seconds to shoot it on the set if you shot at 60 frames per second, but it's going to take you 4 seconds to watch all those frames in the timeline because your playback speed is only 30 frames per second. So it'll appear to be in slow motion. Okay, that's called over cranking your camera. From back in the old days where they would crank the camera And there was in the old days, they didn't have batteries that could run your camera. These are film cameras we're talking about. You'd have a little hand crank on the side of the camera that would determine how many frames you're shooting per second. And you would crank it fast to shoot more frames per second, like 60 frames per second, play it back at a slower frame rate, and you'd have slow motion. Under cranking is the opposite. I would crank the camera really slow. And let's say you shot 2 seconds, stay with the 2 seconds of footage, and you shot it at 15 frames per second. Okay, so you have 30 frames. All right, so you shot for 2 seconds, 15 frames per second. Okay, you bring that footage into your timeline. Your timeline is set up to play back footage at 30 frames per second again. Okay, so I have 30 frames that I shot over 2 seconds on the set. I'm watching my footage at 30 frames per second in my timeline. It's going to take 1 second to watch 2 seconds of footage that I shot on set. So in Premiere, it'll take me 1 second to watch 2 seconds worth of footage that I shot on the set. 2 seconds, 15 frames per second. 15 times 2 is 30. My frame rate, my timeline is 30 frames per second. So I watch 2 seconds worth of footage that I shot in 1 second in the timeline. And that's under cranking, or playing footage, or a fast forward effect. Okay? So the reason why I explained all that is because of the fact that you need to know that in order to do this next section in the chapter. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the sequence speed. Is it speed duration? No, Laura in the snow. Sequence 2, Laura in the snow. All right? Okay. And after I open up that sequence, let's play the clip in the sequence. As you can see, she's walking in slow motion. So this is an example of we overcranked the camera. We shot it at a much higher frame rate than what we're playing at. Say we shot it at 60 frames per second for 26 seconds. 60 frames per second, but we play it back at, say, 30 frames per second. Say 60 frames per second at, say, 6.5 or 7 seconds. Okay. We play it back at 30 frames per second. So that means that to watch all that footage, it's not going to take me the 6 or 7 seconds it took me to shoot it. It's going to take me 13 whole seconds to shoot it, because I'm watching it at a slower frame rate than I shot it on the set. So that's what we just saw. All right. So in this particular case, what I want to do is and by the way, those numbers I gave you, 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second, just now for this clip, those aren't the ones they actually use. They shot it at 96 frames per second and played it back at 24 frames per second. Okay. But that's just a matter of just crunching the numbers and doing the math. That's not a problem at all, just division. So what I want to do is I want to look into the clips to load bin in the project panel. And I want to look for the LoRa01 clip, which is right here. And I want to, before I even edit this to the timeline, what I want to do is I want to control click or right click this clip and choose modify from the contextual menu that pops up. That's what this is called, either a contextual menu or a shortcut menu. And then go to interpret footage. Go to interpret footage. Interpret footage is a place where you go where, hey, I shot it one way, but now I got it in Premiere. I've changed my mind. I know I shot it at 96 frames per second, but I want Premiere to assume a different frame rate. Or I know I shot it at 24 frames per second on the set, but I want Premiere to reinterpret it or change the frame rate before I even take the time to put it in my timeline. Okay? So the interpret footage dialog box, which is what we see right here, inside the modify clip window, tells me how you want Premiere to play it back. I'm going to choose the assume this frame rate button, and instead of playing, it was playing 24 frames per second. That's why I played it slow motion. Okay. I'm going to select assume this frame rate, and I'm going to put 96 in that window. Okay. This tells Premiere to play 96 frames per second. So that means that it's going to play it a lot more frames per second than we did the first time. We're not going to do 24, we're going to do 96, okay, which is 4 times as fast. So if I play it back 4 times as fast, then it's going to take me less time to watch the clip. I clicked OK, right? And I look at my timeline, and if I play it back, she's walking faster, okay? But you see how kind of stuttery it looks? It doesn't look very natural, okay? It's not very natural looking, okay? Very staccato, okay? You'll also notice that well, the reason why it looks staccato like that and kind of not natural is because of the fact that it's speeding through clips. Instead of playing at 24 frames per second, it's playing back at 96 frames per second, all right? Also, if you look at these, I have diagonal lines. I have diagonal lines at the end of the clip. By the way, to get my timeline to zoom to fit, I press the / button that's underneath the delete key on the keyboard, okay? And that will zoom in just enough so that my clips in my timeline will be just big enough to fit in the window. You can see these diagonal lines here in my clip. Basically what those tell you, the diagonal lines indicate that a portion of the clip has no media. Basically it says at this higher rate of 96 frames per second, when I get to here, I've gotten through all the content that they shot on set because I sped through it. I played it back really fast, right? Okay. On set, by the way, they shot just over 3 seconds of footage at 96 frames per second. When I was playing back in my timeline at 24 frames per second, I got like 12 seconds of footage, a little over 12, almost 13 seconds of footage. Well, a little over 13, I think it was. A little over 13 seconds of footage when I played it back at 24 frames per second. I reinterpreted the playback rate of this clip to 96 frames per second, and I only get a 3 second and 8 frame duration in my timeline, okay? Which is how long it took them to shoot it on set. 96 frames per second for 3 seconds and 8 frames, okay? And then after that 3 seconds and 8 frames, they stopped shooting on the set, so I have no more footage. That's where the diagonal lines come in, and that's why my screen is black here, okay? We've watched all the footage they shot. This clip is still 12 seconds, 13 seconds, and 13 seconds and 8 frames long, you know, but I've sped through all the footage right here, okay, by 3 seconds and 8 frames, and the rest of this going all the way up to 13:08, you know, I have nothing more to show you. It's kind of like if you had, I think this particular episode has gone about 13 minutes. It's like if you had 13 minutes that you had to sit in your room and listen to this episode, but you don't listen to it in regular motion. I recorded it regular motion, right? But when you're listening to it, you hit the fast forward button and you play it 4 times faster than I originally recorded it. So I'm talking real fast, okay? It's not going to take you 13 seconds to listen to this entire part of the lecture up until this point. It'll only take you just over 2 minutes. It's not going to take you 13 minutes. I'm sorry. It's not going to take you 13 minutes. It's going to take you it's going to take you just over 3 minutes to listen to the whole 13-minute lecture on 4 times fast forward. So what do you do with the other 10 minutes? I don't know. You just sit there. That's the analogy I'm trying to make with these diagonal lines and a black screen. You know, it's expecting, or you had way more time allocated than you had footage to play. That's the point I'm trying to make. Okay, so we just saw how to reinterpret footage using the reinterpret footage in the project panel. You always activate that. Well, the best place to do it like this, to activate it like this, is in the timeline. I'm sorry, in the project panel. Okay, you know, we've seen the consequences with the diagonal lines, and we ran out of footage, and we can compare the frame rates at which we shot it to the frame rate that we actually play it back in the timeline, because those are 2 different playback speeds, or 2 different speeds. The frame rate you shot it at versus the playback rate that you play back in a timeline. Okay. All right. So they just to prove how just to prove how much more fluid the original is. Okay, when you play it back before you reinterpret it, they say just drag it next to it right here, and you'll see how. Whoops, I'm sorry, wrong one. Let's. I'll just undo it. See how much more fluid and natural that is. Okay. All right. There you go. All right, so I just undid the reinterpret footage by using the keyboard shortcut Command Z. So that's all I have for this section on reinterpreting footage to change your playback speed. That's it for episode 5. We are going to, I'm sorry, just episode 6. This is episode 6. That's it for episode 6. We're going to move on to changing the speed duration of a clip manually with the clip speed duration panel in Premiere.